Hey everyone, it's Colt. Welcome to this video on JavaScript async functions. First, I am moving. I'm in the middle of packing. Sorry for the mess. It will probably impact some of the future videos I have coming up. It's a little harder for me to record things when everything's in boxes, but I'm going to try and get back to a regular schedule as soon as possible. All right, so first thing I want to mention in this video, it does rely on promises. So if you don't know about promises in JavaScript, you're probably going to have a rough time. So I would definitely, there's a link in the description to an article I really recommend, sort of a primer on promises that can get you up to speed for this video. Okay, the next thing, as always, I have to mention, please subscribe, please like the video, please comment, let me know what you think. Turn on notifications. Again, I'm going to send out a poll so students can vote on new topics for videos. So I'd appreciate it if you turn that on. And lastly, I have a quick note. This is not an advertisement, I promise. I'm not getting paid for anything, but here we go. It's not an ad. So I really enjoy making these YouTube videos, but it's a huge amount of work. There's no money involved. I'm just doing it because it's fun. With that said, each video is like a day or two plus of work, solid work between writing the slides, coming up with the code exercises and examples, recording the video, editing the video, uploading it, coming up with a thumbnail. There's just a ton of stuff going on. So one of the things I'm trying to do is find ways to speed that up. And one solution I found is to turn to some of my best friends in San Francisco, some of my favorite coworkers who have gone on to form their own boot camp. I used to teach with them. They have their own boot camp, and they have a ton of great content they're letting me use. So I'm recording videos with tweaked, altered versions of their content. Again, they're not paying me, but I am going to mention them. Their school is called Rhythm School. It's a 16-week program in San Francisco. They have great outcomes. They have students working at Google, Apple, Pinterest, all over the place. 16 students per class maximum. You don't have to pay tuition up front. And I'm going to stop here because this is sounding too much like an ad. But check them out. If nothing else, be thankful for them. I am, because they're some of my best friends. I work out of their office a lot when I'm recording, and they're letting me use some of this content for free. So on with the program, on with async functions. Here we go. So let's start with a quick look at our goals. We want to understand the async keyword. What does it do? As well as its best pal, the await keyword. And then we're going to write a bunch of examples of asynchronous code using async and await. And then we'll wrap up by refactoring examples that use callbacks or promises to instead use async await. And at the very end, we'll also talk a little bit about optimizations we can make. But first, I do need to get this out of the way. If we look at browser compatibility for async functions, there's a lot of green, but unfortunately, Internet Explorer, as often is the case, is still red. So there are polyfills available, but it's just important to be aware of that glaring red spot. All right, so what exactly is the point of async functions? Basically, they are just a prettier, more logical, easier to follow way of writing asynchronous code. So instead of having to do a bunch of nested stuff, a bunch of callbacks, a bunch of promises with .thens chained one after another, we can refactor things to be easier to follow, easier to understand. So the first thing we have to start with is the async keyword itself. So it is new-ish, part of ES2017, and as we saw, not quite there in Internet Explorer. You can declare any function in JavaScript as an async function. And when you do that, it means that the async function is going to return a promise. So inside of that function, if you put the async keyword in front of it, we can write code that looks synchronous, as we've already talked about, even if it isn't. All right, here's our first example. This is not an async function right now. It just returns a string. But if I put the keyword async in front of it, it doesn't return a string anymore. Instead, it's going to return a promise. So just that one keyword does that for us. I didn't explicitly write promise anywhere. So we could do something like friendly function .then, and then just print out that message. And that works just fine. So it behaves sort of like this, where we have a function, it returns promise.resolve by default, and we can call friendly function promise. We get that promise, but we can also call .then and get to our string. Okay, so all of that is just to say that an async function, when you put async there, it's going to return a promise. So what about rejecting a promise? Right now, everything's been fulfilled or resolved. What about when we want to reject it? By default, instead of an async function, the return value is wrapped in a resolved promise, as we've already seen. If you want to reject it instead, simply throw an error. So let me show you an example. Here we have an async function called oops, and all it does is throw an error. So when I call it, if I just call oops, can see this promise has been rejected. So I could catch it and then print the string as well. Okay, so this is not really how we're going to be using async functions, but it's important to know. Now, on to the missing piece, the best part, the await keyword. So the await keyword is used inside of an async function. We use it, and it essentially pauses the execution of that async function, and we can await any async operation returning a promise, including other async functions. Basically, it waits for the promise to resolve, and then it extracts its resolved value. And then after that, it resumes the rest of the async function's execution. It's basically like a pause button, and it's the magic piece that makes our code look synchronous. The very first thing I want to show you, you cannot use await in a non-async function. If we try it, we get this lovely error. Await is only valid in async function. So just keep that in mind. All right, so here's our first real example of an async function where we're using the await keyword. First thing I should say, I am using jQuery here. I've included it over here. If you're not familiar with jQuery, I'm using a method called getJSON. This is a Star Wars API, and I'm requesting it, and that takes time, and getJSON will return a promise. But instead of having to do a bunch of .thens or a callback function, instead, I just say let movie data equal await $.getJSON. And this looks very much like synchronous code. We don't have any nested stuff. We don't have any additional functions that we're writing. If I run it, starting, all done, and then it prints out my code, my data that I just grabbed here. So this is really nice. I love async functions. They're short, relatively short at least, and I have my data here just to prove it to you. This is the Star Wars films, all 7 of them. So hopefully you can already see sort of the magic. It's not doing anything that we couldn't do before. It's just making things look nice. We can follow it, right? This happens first, and then this is going to happen, and then this will happen, and then that would happen. Okay, so let's take a look at some other ways we can write async functions. So here we're writing an async function inside of an object. It's called Star Wars. We've got a property called genre, and then we've added our async function log movie data. So we just need to make sure to add that async keyword. And then we use await just the same, right? We have a variable called URL. We're calling $.getJSON. Again, it's from jQuery. It takes some time. It's making an HTTP request. And this does not print out until this is done. It's a pause button, and it's waiting for this to finish. And so if we run it down here, it takes a moment, but then it prints out our data. We can also add async functions as instance methods on a class. So here I have a class called Pokemon. Each Pokemon has an ID. And then I have an async function with that keyword again called logname. And there's a URL. So this is a Pokemon API where you pass in an ID, and it takes that ID, like what's the first, is Bulbasaur the first Pokemon? Well, whatever the Pokemon numbers are, it doesn't matter if you don't know them. It gets information on that Pokemon. So create the URL, and then we await $.getJSON again, same thing, just a different URL, and then we print out the response. This is just to show you that you can do this inside of a class. So we make a new Pokemon down here, and then we call logname. And I just saved. There we go. Caterpie. Let's see, what are the other ones? Okay, it was Bulbasaur. All right, it's been a while since I had Pokemon cards. All right, so that just shows you we can define a regular old function as an async function. We can put one in an object, put one on a class as an instance method. Now let's talk about handling errors inside of these async functions. So if the promise is rejected, an error is going to be thrown. And what we can do is use a try-catch statement to handle those errors. For example, this function called getUser, it's an async function, uses the GitHub API, and we're going to pass in a username. And there may or may not be, an API endpoint with that username. If someone passed in, get user of this, there's probably nobody with that name. So the API is not going to give us the data we want. The promise will be rejected. So then we can catch it, that error, and then console.log user does not exist. So we have this await, same thing, $.getJSON. The only difference is now we have a try and a catch. So let's give it a shot. Let's start with one that will work. Let's do Andrew. And there we go. We get his name, and then it's Andrew Nesbitt, and then his bio, which is what we decided to print out. Now, if we try it on something that doesn't exist, probably, there we go. We're now printing out user does not exist. So this is how you can handle promises being rejected. So still very nice, non-nested, non-ugly code in my opinion. And it's all due to async await. All right, finally, let's talk about refactoring things that are not using async functions to instead use async functions. So here's an example of just a bunch of nested callbacks. So I'm using that Pokemon API where basically I'm just getting I have a variable base URL, and then I'm adding on /1, and then printing out the first Pokemon is whatever that first Pokemon's name is. And then once that's done, I'm chaining this as a $.get.json again, and doing the second one and the third one. And so when we run this, we get first Pokemon Bulbasaur, then Ivysaur, then Venusaur. Okay, simple enough. But this is nested, right? And this is very simple, this code, but most of us have seen very ugly callbacks. Callback hell is everyone's favorite term. So we could refactor it to use promises, so we don't have as much nested stuff, right? We're not, there's no nested stuff really. We're just chaining .thens one after another. So it's definitely more linear or flatter. It does the same thing. We're just using promises and .then. So if we run this, first one, second, third. Okay, so that's all of the API calls. It's all working great. Now let's take a look at the version that uses async functions. Here we go. So async function, catch some of them. First of all, notice how much easier this is to look at, right? It makes so much more sense to read this. You can see that we have this base URL. We're making 3 requests. There's no additional braces or parentheses or arrow functions. There's no .thens. We just have let Pokemon1 or P1 equal await get JSON of this URL. P2 await this URL. P3 await this URL, and then we print them out. And then we call it, and you'll see eventually, there we go. We get the 3 of them printed out. So this is a lot nicer. However, there's something I should tell you about, which is that this is not the best way to do it. Why not? Well, we're making these 3 requests sequentially, one after another. So each request has to wait for the one before it can begin. So this one has to finish, and then this one will start, and then this one will start. And the requests are completely independent of one another, right? There's no data that they share. There's nothing that we're getting from this API that we're then using here. They have nothing to do with one another. So there's no reason for that, and this could slow us down. And it's kind of hard to tell because this API and this payload is so small, you can't really tell, but we can fix this. And here's one way to do just that. So this one, still an async function. I called it catch some of them parallel. And instead of awaiting up here each time, so instead of 3 separate awaits like we had before, we still have those awaits, but they're moved down. So instead, we're just getting the promise back, and then we're awaiting each promise. And this allows them to happen in parallel rather than sequentially one after another. Now it's going to be hard to tell the difference, so I'm going to run it, and they all show up at the same time, just like the other ones did anyway. So I'm going to show you an example with set timeout that's deliberately slowed down so you can see the difference. All right, so here's a silly example. I have a function called pause. It takes a number of milliseconds. I'm calling it 3 times with 1 second each time. All that it does, it uses set timeout. It's going to wait, 1 second in this case. And most importantly, it returns a promise. So in here, basically imagine this is the API call. This is get JSON instead. Down here, I'm calling it 3 times. And then afterwards, I'm printing out all done in an async function, 3 different awaits. So let's run it down here. And notice it's going to take 3 seconds. Almost there. Come on. There we go. All done. Roughly 3 seconds at least. And it's waiting for all of them to finish. This one happens first, and it has to finish before this happens. And that has to finish before this happens. And then we get all done. Now, if we refactor this with what I showed you previously, which looks something like this here, where we're just grabbing the promises and then awaiting each promise individually, you'll see that it takes roughly 1 second instead of 3 because they're running in parallel. They're no longer waiting one after another. So if I run it, roughly 1 second, and there we go. So that was faster. I was thinking of doing longer values, but it makes it clearer if it's like 10 seconds, but I didn't want to make you wait. So now when we revisit this earlier example with the Pokemon API, hopefully you can tell, these are in parallel now. And so if this happened to take 10 seconds each, which thankfully it doesn't, this is not going to take 30 seconds. they're not happening one after another in sequence. Because of the way we structured this, they're now in parallel. But it's still super fast either way, so that's why I did that whole timer example anyway. Finally, there's one more example here of refactoring it just a bit more. It's sort of up to your personal taste if you like to do it this way. Basically, I use promise.all. So promise.all accepts an array of promises, and it's going to wait for all of them to resolve. So instead, I'm awaiting promise.all instead of awaiting each of these promises individually. And you can see if I move this over here, save, it runs. I mean, again, it's just as fast as before because it's all happening in milliseconds, but trust me, these are running in parallel. So this is another way of doing that. So there was a ton of stuff we covered here, but to sum it all up, async plus the await keyword, async await, is a great way of refactoring code, of creating code that is asynchronous, that is easier to understand and looks synchronous. It's easier to follow. It's just nicer. Fewer nested things, fewer braces and brackets and all that extra JavaScript syntax all over the place. Most importantly, fewer indentations. So I'm a big fan. Hopefully this video wasn't too boring. I know it's not the sexiest topic on earth, but I think it's really important and worth knowing about. Thanks if you made it this far. I appreciate it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks again.